So joining us now with more insight is Bob Litt. He's a former general counsel for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good to see you here in New York.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Okay, so let's talk about this tweet from the president. He tweeted about John Bolton, and I believe he said, "I never told John Bolton that the aid to Ukraine was tied to investigations into Democrats, including the Bidens," right? So the conversation after that was, did the president waive executive privilege by tweeting about the very conversation that John Bolton writes about in the book?
Well, there are a lot of unsettled questions about the applicability of executive privilege in this case. There clearly is a doctrine that says that the president is entitled to get confidential advice from his closest advisors. What's different about this situation is, first of all, it's in the context of an impeachment proceeding. Second of all, the conversations allegedly involve wrongdoing. Third, the president has been speaking about them. And fourth, Bolton has expressed his willingness to testify. So all of these make this an unusual situation. It's not at all clear whether the courts would be willing to intervene at all because it is an impeachment matter, or whether they would leave it to the Senate and Chief Justice Roberts to make a determination as to the applicability of the privilege in this case. It's going to be very interesting to see how this turns out.
You mentioned executive privilege in context of potential wrongdoing.
Right.
Yesterday, one of the president's defense lawyers, Alan Dershowitz, got up there on the floor of the Senate and said, even if what Ambassador Bolton is written in his book turns out to be true, it is not impeachable. So if that's the argument, would the Chief Justice then step in to say, if the president then tried to exert executive privilege over Mr. Bolton testifying, who would be the arbiter of deciding whether or not there was wrongdoing if the president's defense lawyers are saying that's not even wrong what Bolton put in the book?
Well, first of all, that statement sort of puts the cart before the horse. The reason for having Bolton testify is because there are credible allegations of wrongdoing, and you have to determine whether they took place or not. The allocation of authority between the Chief Justice and the Senate is really ultimately up to the Senate. The Senate makes the rules for impeachment. The Chief Justice can make a ruling, which the Senate could overturn if it wanted to. It puts the Chief Justice, I think, in an uncomfortable hot spot, and it's not clear that he's going to want to make a ruling on this.
So Senator Doug Jones suggested that if the Senate cannot speak to Bolton, then maybe they should just subpoena the manuscript. Is that something the Senate can do? What are the pros and cons when it comes to something like that?
Oh, the Senate can clearly subpoena the manuscript. They have the subpoena authority. It's not clear that the manuscript would be treated any differently than Bolton's testimony about the same thing. If there is an executive privilege, it would apply to a written statement of these conversations just as much as it would to Bolton's oral testimony. The reason Bolton submitted the manuscript for the White House was for the White House to have an opportunity to determine what portions could and could not be publicly released. It will be very interesting to see how the White House handles that.
Yes.
So, but one thing, just explain to our audience then, if you've got the president's lawyer saying, look, even if what Bolton says in his book actually happened, it's not an impeachable offense, but then you've got the president's lawyers or the president saying, look, we don't want Bolton to testify at all. I mean, if you're just a layperson watching this at home, it doesn't make a lot of sense, because if there's nothing wrong, and if you haven't done anything wrong, and if it was a perfect call the way the president keeps saying it is, and also you just tweeted, the president did, that he never told Bolton any of that stuff, why not just let him testify?
Look, it just emphasizes the kind of Alice in Wonderland nature of these proceedings. In any kind of ordinary legal proceeding, there's no question that Bolton would be called to testify. He clearly was a participant in these discussions who has information that nobody else who's testified has. One of the linchpins of the president's defense to date has been there's no witness who can say that he or she saw me or heard me give this order. Well, here's a witness who says, I did see and hear the president give this order. So in an ordinary legal proceeding, there's no question that Bolton would be called to testify.
And I think it's so funny that we're throwing around this executive privilege option when we're all discussing what happened in that conversation. Like, it's sort of out there already. And executive privilege, as I understand it, primarily has to do with national security. And clearly that's not the case here.
Well, it's broader than national security. The fundamental principle is that the president's entitled to get confidential advice from his closest advisors, that his advisors shouldn't have to worry that the advice they give the president will later be exposed, which is why the fact that Bolton is willing to testify about this matter is a relevant consideration to be considered in assessing whether or not executive privilege should block his testimony.
Could the White House do anything to stop him
Well,
from
that's what the
testifying?
New York Times is saying, that they're floating a potential restraining order. Would that work in an impeachment trial?
Who knows? We've never had that situation before. Presumably, if they can get a court to issue an order, Bolton is a lawyer. Presumably, he would honor an order of the court as long as it remains in effect. But it's not clear that a court would have jurisdiction or would be willing to enter into what's essentially a dispute between Congress and the president. Typically, the courts say, you guys work this out on your own. Don't draw us into the middle of this.
So John Bolton's revelation, this bombshell, is that he did indeed talk to me about the military aid to Ukraine and that it was tied to these investigations. The GAO said absolutely, in their opinion, what the president did was illegal. But the defense lawyers for the president seem to be arguing almost all over the place. They seem to be arguing that it's not a crime, he didn't do anything illegal, but then we know that, impeachment doesn't have to be a crime. So then they're also arguing it's not an impeachable offense. I mean, what's your take on their argument?
Well, there are parts of it that are more plausible than others. Mm-hmm. There's a whole factual side of it, which is being undercut on a daily basis by evidence that comes out. There's an argument that says, don't look at us, look at Joe Biden, which has absolutely nothing to do with whether or not the president did what he's accused of doing. Mm-hmm. And there is the proposition that says, okay, he did it all, but it's not an impeachable offense. Only that last one is really a plausible legal argument.
Mm. And with that, and before we wrap this up, Bob, this may be sort of an esoteric sort of legal question, but people say, like you and others say, when we ask questions about the Chief Justice, people say, well, the Chief Justice really doesn't want to get involved in that because it sets precedent, and there's a sense that you do not want to expand the judiciary in any way. But what I keep hearing is that the president's power continues to grow. In other words, as these precedents are set by the president of the United States, executive power grows, and Congress and the judiciary, the other two branches of government, stay the same. In other words, unable to check the president's power as it grows because the Chief Justice or the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court says, well, I don't want to establish a precedent that could indicate that I'm expanding the powers of the court, and the Congress and the Senate says, I don't want to do something because I don't want to make it seem as if I'm expanding the powers of the Congress. Meanwhile, the president's power is growing.
Well, I think one of the extraordinary things about the Trump presidency has been the extent to which the Congress, and particularly the Republicans in Congress, have been willing to totally give up traditional congressional prerogatives in order to back the president. They have opposed congressional oversight that they exercised vigorously against the Obama presidency. They've basically allowed the president to do whatever he wants with appropriated funds. I think there's a real need for a correction here in terms of limits, appropriate limits, checks and balances, as the framers wrote into the Constitution, on the president's powers.
All right, Bob Litt.
Bob Litt,
great talking to you.
Thanks to be here.